Yes.
Okay, hello? Oh, that's loud. Okay, we're gonna get started since we are at capacity. First of all, thank you so much for being here. I know there's been almost a dozen panels on AI and journalism this year, so hopefully you all are still excited but not too fatigued. Unfortunately, Taylor Owen can't join us today, so Anya, who's super brilliant, is gonna be joining us in place of him. Yeah, and so just a little bit about me before I set up the panel. I'm a staff reporter at Tech Policy Press. Some of the beats that I do are AI legislation, the Digital Services Act, online speech, and a bunch of other things. I formerly worked at Columbia University's Tao Center for Digital Journalism under Emily Bell. I first worked on our Journalism Crisis project, and then later led our Platforms and Publishers project, where we primarily tracked funding from the Facebook Journalism Project and Google News Initiative into the industry, just because a lot of that money was not accounted for, and in order to measure impact, one must know where that money went and how it was spent. Yeah, and so before I let them introduce themselves, I kind of just want to give an overview. The name of the panel is The Rise of AI Journalism After Platforms, which is a bit of a contradiction, and we'll kind of get into that and what constitutes a platform in the current technological landscape as the panel goes on. But this panel was kind of born of me and I think several others becoming increasingly concerned that certain publishers were once again making these huge secretive deals that were bound by NDAs with big tech companies over technology that we're not even really sure about their capabilities, their reliability, their accuracy. A lot of it's bound up in like potential hype. We just don't know. And there are really smart people here actually at this festival doing great work to implement trustworthy AI systems into their newsrooms. Like I think a lot of you probably were at the AI News Showcase yesterday, which was super great. But it did start to feel like we'd seen this movie before with Facebook and Google, which are very distinct relationships with the news industry, which we'll probably make a point on later, but which involved them pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into the global news ecosystem that arguably was in part to advance their own policy interests. Yeah, and some of the newer deals that have happened recently, like December, Axel Springer, which owns Politico and Business Insider, among other companies, they inked a deal with OpenAI for tons of millions of dollars. In January, The Information reported that OpenAI was moving super quickly to get licensing agreements out the door that were between $1 and $5 million to publishers. Again, we don't know the terms of those. Apple's trying to strike similar publisher deals. We don't know the terms of those. So it's really early days, but these might be setting the industry standards of the relationship between publishers and AI companies going forward. So yeah, we're gonna look at these past deal making and the subsequent legislation that has arisen from those that were attempted to like rebalance the power asymmetry between big tech and the news industry, to think about how we're gonna approach this new relationship with AI companies. So brief intros from our panelists and how your work relates to the topic.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Gabby. So hi everyone. I'm Charis Papaevangelou. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Amsterdam, based at the Institute for Information Law. And just briefly, I would like just to thank you for, putting together this timely panel and inviting me to be amongst you. So I'm currently I'm part of a project which is called Public Values in the Algorithmic Society that is funded by the Dutch government. And I'm currently looking into how the novel platform regulation in the European Union predominantly is having or is going to have an effect on the relationship between the press and platform companies. This basically builds on previous work that effectively secured me a spot on this panel, which I did primarily during my PhD and my doctoral research, where I looked at how platform companies, namely Google and Meta, have been attempting over the last decade or so to entrench their dependencies or the dependencies of the press on on their services, on their infrastructure, and so on and so forth. One of the, I guess, most relevant, I would say, projects that I have done, it was actually conducted during my research fellowship at the Center for Media Tech and Democracy, that is actually run by Taylor, who's unfortunately couldn't be here, where I sort of did what exactly Gabby said in her introduction, try to follow the money in an investigative journalistic kind of way, and trace how the Google News Initiative and the Meta Journalism Project were actually run, what kind of priorities or what kind of journalism they were trying to prioritize, and so on and so forth. One other aspect I would say that is quite relevant and that I will conclude is that is often not very much spoken about is the other aspects of the relationship between the press and the platforms, which is not only the economic or financial aspect of it, but also the infrastructural and the actual distribution, monetization, and all of the rest, which is done primarily through their digital spaces, and how that content is governed, for instance, or moderated by those companies is not often discussed, but it's actually part of this emerging regulatory framework in the European Union. And it's actually quite interesting to get into that, I think. And with that, I will conclude just my brief introduction. And again, very happy to be here. Thanks.
Great. Did you just want me to introduce myself, or?
Yeah, go ahead and also, how some of the work is applicable to today.
Okay, great. I'm Anya Schifrin, and I teach at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. And I'm very happy to be replacing Taylor because we've been working together for quite a while now on, it sounds like, complementary topics to what you're doing. And congratulations on your PhD, Charis. Are we all going to be able to read it? Is it somewhere out publicly?
Yes, this should be already out, but due to French bureaucracy, it's taking forever. I hope that it will be out by this summer.
Okay.
I will let you know, and thank you so much.
And I hope you find a publisher too. So I think what a lot of us have been working on is precisely this question of platforms and publishers. Emily has obviously been working on it for years. I've been taking a sort of narrow look at payment for publisher content, and Taylor has just done a study about what's been happening in Canada, so I can talk a little bit about that. I can talk a little bit about the bargaining codes. I wasn't sure if you wanted me to plunge right in with that topic or just, okay, great, so that's what I'm doing. And I've had the great honor of teaching with Emily, and I would love to do it again.
It's my excellent administrative skills that you liked. Anya and I are colleagues and friends at Columbia University. My name's Emily Bell. I run the Tower Centre for Digital Journalism, which is within the journalism school. Before that, which is sort of slightly relevant to the subject, I, for 10 years, was editor-in-chief of all of the Guardian's digital assets from 2000 to 2010, roughly. So I sort of lived the implementation of new technologies and new platforms, and we did lots and lots and lots of innovation, often using third-party software. And at the time, we thought it was a great opportunity for the reform movement for journalism. That's how we saw. Now, I know that lots of you probably weren't even alive during the period that I was talking about. Some of you will remember it, and I'm sorry for, I think we say re-triggering. But it was a very different sort of expectations of what technology would deliver. And then, so for really since 2012, 2013, because I came out of the newsroom with a lurking suspicion that that relationship was asynchronous and asymmetric, and it was not going to be good for journalism. So the Tower Centre has done platforms and publishers work really since about 2013 with a number of big reports. And we're sort of not following our own advice. We're pivoting to AI to add on to that work at the moment. So we're tracking ethics policies, we're tracking payments to newsrooms. We're also teaching, to be perfectly frank, we're teaching a lot of AI tools in our classroom. So really, we're very focused on how do we unpick and understand that relationship of power between these incredibly large technology companies and the increasingly small journalism field in terms of numbers and in terms of financial strength. So that sort of frames where we are with the technology.
All right, thank you. So I mentioned this at the top, but the theme of the panel is publishers after platforms in the age of AI. And one of the things that has arisen from our conversations, even at this festival, is that not only do we have some of the same players, like the Google News Initiative is still in the game. It's one of the funders of this conference. They were making these publisher deals very different in nature, but now they're making different publisher deals. And a lot of these people who were in the Facebook Journalism Project, were in the Google News Initiative, they're also just moving to different companies. Like, these are the same actual players involved. So is it a false dichotomy to phrase this as a different era, like a new era of AI and publishers? If one of you wants to take that. I know Emily just spoke.
So, I think this is a really difficult question, because I don't think it is in terms of the power relationship that I was just talking about, but there is something sort of just different about the fact that in the previous era, it was really about thinking about these third parties as distribution platforms. AI sort of kicks it up a notch, because you're also sort of they're sort of ingestive platforms as well. So you're going to be using them in your workflows. You're going to be surrendering potentially or selling your content, or just having your content taken by systems where you don't know how it is going to manifest. And actually, frankly, neither do the companies that are building LLMs either. So we have, I feel, even less control. I think the underlying drivers are the same, but the fact that there's so little, we had so little real insight in 2010 into how the social mobile web was going to play out, that we made tons of terrible decisions, I think, as publishers on that road, and I think platforms made some bad decisions as well. My worry is that we should have learned a lot from the last 10 years, but because of these subtle differences in the dynamics of what's actually been asked of publishers and potentially what they can get from it, the role of news in this environment, the role of journalists in this environment, that I worry, A, that we're not applying even the most basic lessons that we've learned, which is don't jump in with both feet, don't try and understand your own power as being an independent entity. But also, I think there are a whole load of new, really difficult legal, ethical, practical, technical questions that are coming down the pipe. I know that's not a clean answer, but, it depends. I've both sides of that one.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be different things like copyright. These licensing agreements aren't just about using their tools. It's also about protecting themselves from legal things. There's New York Times is a big case that I do want to draw attention to. They're suing OpenAI for violating their terms of services, and so there's a lot to unpack there. Did you want to go next, Charis?
Yeah, sure. Totally. Agree with what Emily said. I think that it is a kind of yes and no kind of situation where, on the one hand, again, there are definitely similarities with the previous sort of era, especially when near the end of the previous era, if you want to say that there was indeed an end. For instance, I would say that, because also you touched upon this, Emily, Gabby, sorry. When you said that, there have been like Meta and Google have been taking distinctive approaches to, their connection and the relationships with publishers. And one thing that I, sort of identified during my, through my research is that, for instance, like Facebook or Meta entered this space of trying to make deals with publishers and in a way make their relationship better in terms of public relations and whatever. When there was this so-called techlash, right? Like when there was this backlash of the role and the responsibilities that tech companies have vis-a-vis our digital public spaces, our public spheres, our democracy, and so on and so forth. So around 2017, 2018, right? So this is the time when they sort of intensified their funding sort of endeavors. This is also true for Google, which sort of pivoted, because Google has had a much more longer, right, relationship with the press since the zeros. Like Emily knows that better than I, for sure. But this is when they also made their efforts global, right, with the Google News Initiative, which was previously the Digital News Initiative, which was targeting Europe more or less, right? And both of them, both of the companies, were actually trying to fund publishers and news media organizations more on a project basis, right? Like they were trying to fund what is considered to be innovative journalism. They were doing workshops. They were doing fellowships. They were giving advertising credits to publishers to spend in their advertising systems and the like. And this is where it gets interesting, and this is where it sort of gradually shifts into this new era of AI, when this type of funding came slowly to an end around a couple of years ago, with Meta effectively shifting away totally from the news industry, also very concretely, right? Like since up until 2022, they were also co-sponsoring this festival, but now they're out of here, right? And Google News Initiative started to shift away from those innovation grants and the likes, and started to ramp up their sort of efforts with the Google News Showcase. And this is very seminal, I think. That's very important to underscore, because Showcase is a licensing program, and these are the types of deals that we're currently seeing with OpenAI, right? Like these are licensing agreements. And this is important because it's sort of, I'm sure that we're gonna get into that more, but it reframes, in my opinion, the whole, value of news, how we perceive news and how these companies are perceiving news, right? And I think that is quite short-sighted to sort of jump in on those agreements, which are, again, licensing agreements. They're not one-off.
Yeah. Can I come in and do a little? Yeah. So the way I look at it is we have a big, big problem. Google and Facebook are enormous, powerful global companies. The US has let them get very, very large, and for decades now, they have been profiting from news enormously. Not just the advertising, but news makes them more interesting and drives user engagement. So somewhere, somehow, publishers should be getting revenue from this basic relationship. And what's happened is these companies are so large that they have not contributed their share to this relationship. They've driven some traffic, but they haven't really paid taxes, and they haven't really paid proper licensing. The showcase amounts are small. And so there's been this sort of global problem. In Europe, they tried to impose copyright and licensing fees, and the platform said, no, thank you. We don't really want to do this. And so one of the bright spots has been attempts to get publishers to negotiate collectively with these platforms. And in 2020, Australia started talking about forcing Google and Meta to pay publishers. And in 2021, they passed a law called the Australian News Media Bargaining Code. Now, it's not the perfect solution, and it's not going to provide revenue forever, but it immediately put 250 million Australian dollars a year into journalism. and it created a lot of jobs. And interestingly, it eroded Rupert Murdoch's total domination because people like The Guardian were suddenly able to hire more reporters. And I think that understanding that framework and that idea of the contribution that news makes is essential for understanding how we're going to deal with the large language models. Because it's the same playbook again. It's these really large American companies that are scooping up information and then doing deals secretly with certain publishers that they choose to speak to. So that's how I'm thinking about this. And I can talk more, but that's my kind of basic framework of understanding that news has been undervalued, that publishers need to work collectively, and that these large secretive companies are dividing and conquering.
Sorry, this is a nightmare panel for Gabby to moderate because we all have lots to say. I think it's also important to say there are two different types of, there's two tracks here. We're talking about a large systems policy one, but there's also the practical in the newsroom. So there are two types of deals if we're talking about that. Framework, one of which is what's the value of what you do and how can you extract it. But the other one is actually how do we work with the tools in the newsroom and they're already there. So everybody at some level is probably already has AI in their workflow, and anyone who saw Chris Moran's demonstration of what's happening at The Guardian yesterday about summarising and headline writing and things like that, that those are beginning to be applications that we will see more and more of. And incidentally, in things which are not newsrooms, and I think this is another thing to think about, how this is going to change our world as journalists. One of the other things we study at the Town Centre is things that look like news but really aren't news, whether it's propaganda or dark money or whatever, or algorithmically generated stories. There is the possibility that while we are in rooms like this, thinking about ethical implications, thinking about how we get fair value, there is a massive and very rapidly growing industry of stuff that is not news, but looks like news, which is already using AI full force to create huge amounts of content, most of which is of pretty low value, some of which is actually, malicious, so deepfakes, etc., etc. So I think there's so when we're talking about the difference between the eras, I think that this is another difference, which is the kind of those pathways to how do we do good journalism here and how do we undermine journalism or do bad stuff. Those are also established, and the people who do the bad stuff have no qualms about adoption and use.
And if I may, these are related.
Yeah, no, totally.
Because the bad stuff will overpower the large language models. And that's why publishers have value at the moment, because they are needed, accurate information is needed, so that we don't have what's called model degradation.
Yeah, and if I may also jump in and add something, is that one of the, I guess, like lessons that we could draw from the previous era is also that, these are kind of, technologies and infrastructures that are here now that we're being, that we're signing those agreements, but like it's not entirely certain that they're gonna be around when the new thing, comes in, right? For instance, and I'm thinking about now how Facebook, for instance, right? Like they had publishers and news media organizations adopt so many of those of their tools, like instant articles or that other licensing program, like Facebook News, right? Or other kind of tools and infrastructures that were just like basically, they pulled the plug, right? So publishers had to comply with their demands and whatever new sort of technology they were handing out there, and entrenching their dependency again, and making them more and more contingent, I guess, on them. And then you have to just consider that it's not in their interest to preserve what is the public value of journalism, right? It's at the end of the day, it's just trying to make or maximize profit and for their shareholders and so on and so forth. So it's also, I think, important to take stock of that lesson concerning the underlying infrastructure and the dependencies in that regard.
Yes, very active panel, nightmare panel to moderate. No, this is great. So I think with that, and also I will say, because this is a room full of mostly journalists, in that era where, the pivot to video, a lot of these newsrooms staffed up their video teams. And as soon as they pulled the plug, all of those video producers, all of the support teams for that, they lost their jobs as well.
So the good news is that what we've learned from that is before AI even gets here, you'll have noticed from the American media, is that they've preempted that by sacking everybody at the beginning of the cycle rather than the end. So all of the sort of the answers about, and I guess this really gets to the point about, are we post-platforms? And I would like to think the answer, so, it's like life after platforms. There is no life after platforms. It is the sea in which we swim. The platforms are just going to change. But calibrating that relationship to them is absolutely the right question. And we do, and, Charis is the person who really knows most, I think, about this on the panel, is the other thing we have the Brussels effect. We have European legislation, which we didn't have, and we really haven't done well, I think, in the US in producing any effective legislation, which does actually help sort of frame out some of these things. But I think, kind of the fact that we're already deciding that newsrooms have to be a lot smaller, and it's not always AI, it's sometimes just bad management. A lot of it is the collapse of the advertising industry, which is AI related. But I do think that, kind of there's my bright spot would be that we've actually got a framework. So whether or not that regulatory framework works for everywhere would be interesting.
Yeah, no, that sets us up for a really good segue, because I do want to talk about the existing legislative frameworks across Europe, across Australia and Canada, across, well, in the US there's not much, but there are some mechanisms that Emily has spoken about earlier this week on antitrust, the Brussels effect. So maybe we could kind of get a quick overview on what those are for the people in this room, as well as what the nature of that relationship is, and it's very early days, but is this kind of like a lobbying effort, like 2.0? So whoever wants to jump in on that. Yeah, go for it.
So Emily's point about life after platforms brings me nicely to Taylor's and his center's research on what happened in Canada. So after Australia passed their law, many other countries started looking at doing their own version. And I can definitely talk about South Africa and Brazil, where I think Google has been doing a great job of killing these laws. But what happened in Canada was they went ahead and they took that same idea of power imbalances and said, okay, Google and Meta, you need to come to some sort of agreement with the publishers. And they passed a bill called C-18. And it's been very interesting seeing what's happening in Canada, because the first thing that happened was that Meta left and dropped Canadian news. And remember, Google had done this in Spain in 2014, so we have some precedent. And Taylor has and the amounts that the publishers got are far less than they should have gotten. I think it was 100 million Canadian. But there were a few things about the Canadian law which were better than the Australian law. One of the Australian law had really no transparency at all, and that's part of the playbook, is not releasing what deals the publishers are getting, because that way you can play people against each other, which is what the OpenAI companies are doing. So Canada said the amounts had to be reported to the regulators, and I believe that they agreed on a particular amount per journalist, because of course really important is to make sure the money goes to journalism and not to the hedge fund that's just, bought the American newspaper or whatever. But Taylor and his group have just released a study 2 days ago about the impact of what's happened in Canada. And, one thing that's pretty terrifying is that publisher traffic has fallen, as you would expect, and by being dropped by Meta. And it's hit the small digital native outlets worse than the large publishers. And this has happened in other parts of the world when Meta's downgraded news. The larger publishers often, recover eventually. They get enough traffic to their own sites. Second of all, without the good quality information, you get much more fake news. But I thought what was interesting about Taylor's study, and we'd heard a preliminary version in November, and I think that what's been key is that people are still engaging with news in Canada, but they're sending screenshots of news to each other, and also memes. So I think this, the story that nobody wants news, I think is called a little bit into question by what's happened in Canada, but there have been significant traffic drops, and I'm really happy to recommend, what's the name of the center? How can people find that report, Charis? It's a very long, Center for Media Democracy.
Center for Media Tech and Democracy, yeah.
Yeah, so you can read the whole study there.
McGill University.
Yeah.
So I was just sort of listening to Anya and thinking about those kind of value propositions and news avoiders, and this is where actually sort of picking up this question of AI, I think, is interesting for perhaps some of the positive benefits. I was also worried that we're agreeing too much. So one of the things where I think there's a positive opportunity is actually being able to find and connect to audiences more directly with much more efficiency through AI tools. So I think that, ironically, one of the legacies of the sort of platform era, which is being driven off social, and news is being driven off social, I mean, you can sort of see it everywhere. If you look at sort of the post-Musk Twitter, which incidentally something which is not really talked about, is what a disaster that has been for local journalists. It's a disaster for local journalists because they work often individually, certainly in sort of America in kind of spread out rural places, certainly everywhere else in shrinking newsrooms, and it's a really great way to connect with, or was a great way to connect with expert sources, etc. All of that has been degraded. So if we're looking at AI in a positive way, we might be able to, I think, look at the kind of the pushing away of news from platforms as, can we take some of the efficiencies and power of AI to actually create something which stands, which enables us to connect much more directly and efficiently with audiences and produce sort of fairly complex journalism at a slightly lower cost. Charis looks like he doesn't agree.
No. No, it's just that I wanted just to give a bit of the European sort of take on this, in the sense of like if we imagined the approach to regulating tech platforms and the companies in a spectrum, or on the one hand, or the one end of the spectrum, you would have like the more systemic market-based approaches to regulating these platform companies, and on the other end, you would have the more narrow sectoral approaches, like the bargaining codes, right? Which they are like not oppositional one to another. You could argue that they also can work complementary one to another, but they have sort of different objectives. So on the one hand, and I think that it's like more optimal, in my opinion, to sort of target them on a systemic level and market level, because the imbalances that are there, the power imbalances, are actually created because of those, market, the market power that they enjoy, and the sort of the objectives would be to address that, and this could have and would have certainly, as an externality, if you will, in the language of economics, addressing also the power imbalances between press and those companies. Whereas on the other hand, you would have like potentially, or ideally, right, like you would have more, as Anya said, like direct and immediate positive effects and a positive sort of being new revenue streams for the press, which I think is quite interesting to have. But I definitely would, like, for instance, in my again, taking a step back and seeing at the European approach, which is, targeting these companies through the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, or the AI Act, all those different sort of new regulations which are actually trying to, impose obligations for those companies to respect fundamental rights, to respect media pluralism, of course, media freedom, to sort of prohibit abusive practices like, self-preferencing, have transparency with regard to how they moderate content, open up their data repositories, make that data available to both business users and other complementers like news media organizations, which are very crucial, right? Or to researchers and journalists. And like a plethora of other sort of, obligations that are actually trying to take this on a more systemic level. I think this is the right approach to making, at some point, reaching a more level playing field.
I think that's sort of systemic versus individual approach. In America at the moment, we can, again, I said this the other day, the antitrust is sort of our only tool at the moment that's available to change this, and it's just not really adequate, I think. I mean, but I do think that, I'm already hearing this, don't legislate too quickly, because we don't really know what we're looking at. I think that's not right. Sorry, yes.
I agree, and I think like Tim Wu and the Biden White House, they're sort of saying, let's wait, let's see what the risks are, because that's the nature of our paralyzed system. This point about data that you made is obviously really important, and it's also important when publishers want to value their news because they need to know audience data, and that's something that the platforms keep very secret. And I was approached recently in South Africa because they have a very broad Freedom of Information Act, and I think that you can apply for information if you need it to carry out your basic rights. The South Africans in the audience will be able to clarify. And so one of the publishers in South Africa is using the Freedom of Information Act and saying to Google, we need to know our audience numbers as part of our right to information. And I'm sure Google will say no. Guy Berger was talking about how also they approached all the platforms and said, we want to know what you're doing about the elections. And nobody even answered, except for Google that just sent a normal template. So there are limits, but any of you from countries where you have a very broad freedom of information laws, you may be able to try to use those to get some data. And I'm thinking a lot of Europe. When I lived in Vietnam, I was always trying to find out, what the World Bank was doing or where the aid money was going, and the Swedish embassy always had to give me everything because they had such transparent laws. So anything they were involved with, they would release. So there may be some scope in some countries around the world to get some of this information.
Well, no, we're going to start taking questions soon. So if you do want to add a final thought, so that's also a warning to the audience to start preparing your questions.
One thought I have is concerns the value of news, which I don't know. It might not be a very popular opinion, but I think that for a very long time we have also been treating news as we as a collective, right, like society, policymakers, and also the industry, predominantly through the market, like a market perspective and a commercial perspective, which has been of course, undermined and undervalued significantly economically by platform companies and in the mobile, especially era, the digital era and the social era. At the same time, I think that these sort of new era, if you want to call it like that again, and with regulation being here, actually already being active and enacted in Europe, And not only Europe. Like, I don't want to take a very Eurocentric approach. I just happen to be more familiar with that, right? It seems to me that if we also want to frame news as something more, right, as something more than a commodity, and we actually believe, in the normative value of news, the value that it has for citizenship and democracy. At some point, I think the ultimate goals would also be starting to treat news as something that is not entirely, not commercial, right, as a commodity. And if I just may add something, I think this is slightly hinted at one regulation that is not very often discussed in Europe, which is called the European Media Freedom Act, which you might have heard, or the EMFA. Like the acronyms of Europe has, it's gotten unhinged. But one of the provisions that there is within that regulation concerns how platforms, very large online platforms like Google and the likes, are moderating content, and specifically editorial content, like press, journalistic content. And in that, they have an elevated. I'm not going to go into technical details. I'm just going to say that they are framing editorial content as distinctively different than user-generated content. So they inherently inscribe a different value, right, in how platforms should be treating content. And I think this sort of signals potentially a paradigmatic shift, and I think we should also be treating that, right?
Yeah, I think you've raised a really interesting point, which is as quality information becomes more scarce, it's going to become more valuable, right? Basic supply and demand. And we're seeing people paying for it. But I think you wanted to take questions, right,
yes,
Gabby?
I do. Okay, let's take, since there's a few hands up, let's take 2 questions at once. Here, you over there.
Hi. Can you hear me? Hello? Yes? Okay. Hi, Christoph Schweiger, freelance journalist from Malta. What are some things journalists can do to maintain a sense of agency as these AI platforms continue to rise, so we avoid being thrown around like a ragdoll again?
Right.
Wait, we're going to do, yeah.
Oh, so are you going to take more than
Yeah.
one? Okay.
The one in the corner, the gentleman in the corner.
Agency. Okay, let's write these down.
Hi, thank you. I'm Peter, I'm an investigative journalist in London. Question for Emily. You talked about the 2 categories of deals, where there's sort of usage deals and also like copyright licensing deals. Do you think those categories are really separable? Like, does signing a usage deal maybe undermine the moral or legal case that you're trying to make when you say that the licensing or copyright is sort of fundamentally unfair?
Yeah, we can go there, because Emily had things to say about both. So do you want to jump in?
Okay, well, we should probably take both questions, but I'll start with that one because it's a really good. I think it's a really good question. I think they're seen as being separate within news organisations from the people that I've spoken to who are doing those deals, and this I think is really fascinating from a sort of an ex-media reporter point of view. The world is dividing at the moment into Microsoft newsrooms and Google newsrooms. So it's really interesting when you look at the New York Times, they are taking Microsoft to court to put a value on their copyrighted material. But they're not taking Google to court, which is a bit weird. But if you look at the New York Times tech stack and you look at the massive deals that they have done with Google over a long period of time, it's very clear why they're not taking Google to court, because they are what is internally known as a Google newsroom. And I think sort of some of these sort of slightly nerdy observations that we were making as researchers are actually weirdly now actually in the language of boardrooms. And to some extent that's very bad news, because I think it just reinforces this idea of power, which I'm going to try and segue to your question about. This feels like these systems things feel so far away from the newsroom, and like, what can we do as journalists to return? I think if you're in a newsroom, the one thing you can do is learn the technology and the skills and start using them, because I can tell you, having been a journalist and also having been a manager, the managers will not be doing it as well or with as much knowledge. If a good good newsroom leadership, I think at this point, needs to really let ground up insights lead, and that's where the deals, I think, are also slightly problematic, because they're nearly all being dropped on newsrooms from the top. So I think one thing you can do is actually just become your own advocates and advisory panels, and experimenters and implementers. I think outside newsrooms, first-party data, who's on your email list, who's, like building actual relationships. There have been several sessions here. I'm so old, I have to apologise for this, but I remember talking about events in journalism in like 2003, so 20 years ago now. It's coming back in that sort of, okay, we need real spaces. We need to have agency where we meet, and particularly in local, where we are in the community. This is no longer just about producing, it never has been just about producing coverage. So I think that actually being a journalist, being there, and trying to build those much stronger relationships. We talked about solutions journalism for a long time. We're beginning to see, particularly in the States, I think now, areas where this is actually really working, instead of just being like, oh, it would be nice if that worked. I think now it actually is working. So
Just very quickly on that. I think one of like my manager, like Natalie Hellberger, has been focusing very much, like she's an expert on European law and has been focusing very much on the AI Act right now. So one thing that she has been advocating for, especially when it comes to actually, the lived experience of journalists and editors within newsrooms, is also, like, as piggybacking on what Emily said about like knowing the technology, when knowing what you are asking also for when you're procuring that technology. So have, make sure that, I guess, you as a newsroom, if it's possible, like push for an adoption of a list, right, for a criteria that would constitute what constitutes, a responsible use of AI, and that is actually, just be mindful of the procurement process, the value chain of the AI technology that you're adopting and you're using, and so on and so forth. Like many other stuff, but I'm gonna stop here because.
Okay, we'll take another question. Oh, yeah, you right there.
Thank you. And this is for Emily. Emily, you said that you think that AI tools may help publishers to connect to its audiences in a more direct and efficient way. Could you please develop a little bit on that, what you have in mind?
So we even actually sort of at Columbia, we're doing first of all, personalization just becomes easier if you have the right first-party data. So that's something of an if. I think sorry, don't want to be jargony, but the sort of the way there is a very bad way to use targeting and personalization, but also there's a very good way to use targeting and personalization. But it's actually it's always been very expensive, and this is where we can actually learn a lesson, I think, from the dark arts and the political arena. When ChatGPT first came out last year, we heard from political agents, etc. This is great. All of that down ballot races, so like tiny elections in the States, we can employ the kind of sort of tactics that we have employed at national level, because we can actually find where people are and we can send them individualized messages. As a journalist, you think, holy shit, that doesn't sound good. But actually, kind of, now actually newsrooms are like, well, actually, maybe we can use these tools to craft sort of different updating personalized messages that people really, really find useful. So that's one. The other one is just like basic accessibility. You can now kind of have audio for every single one of your articles at a relatively low cost. You can have different languages. There are so many small local areas where you have dozens of different languages, and that used to be too expensive. Now it's going to be a trivial cost for those. So I'm not, as I say, I think that there are tons and tons of ways that you can use these tools to actually sort of for good and for connectivity rather than for bad.
Do we have time? We have time for at least one more.
Yeah, no, we've got time for a couple more. That's cool.
Yeah,
Thank you. Marine Du from Medan. I have one question. We talk about what could journalists do. What could publishers do? Because what I can see in France, we talk about the first era with Google and Facebook, and now, 1 month ago, Prisa and Le Monde just signed partnerships in France, and it's like nothing happened for 10 years, so what could we do? Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I think that as we have conducted also a case study on looking into the France case of with my former manager Nikos Myrneos, where we sort of looked at the negotiations and the agreements that Google and Meta, primarily Google, tried to strike with French publishers based on the copyright directive, right, from 2019. Because you have to remember that France was the first country to transpose the copyright directive. One thing that we identified, of course, there are many lessons that we can draw from that. And just to drop this out here, a few weeks ago, the competition authority in France issued another penalty to Google for not having actually complied with its own agreed upon injunctions for building on a different fine from a few years back, and for negotiating, let's say, in bad faith. So plenty of abuses also from Google on that end. So one of the main lessons for publishers, I think, from that period going forward would be, try to come together. I'm laughing because I know, especially France is a very particular case where, there's a lot of there's not a uniform sort of a collective front. It's sort of fragmented. But we found that the lack of information among the publishers and news media organizations that were not part of the publishers and that were negotiating, for instance, a PIG, or the smaller and more local publishers that were not part of those deals couldn't make it into the negotiating table. Also, specialized magazines like L'Equipe and other could not make it. So come together and just advocate for transparency, and also do not be afraid, I guess, to fight them in court, because this actually turned out to be a very successful case for the competition authority.
I'm getting the time's over. But I will say, we've seen time and time again across countries, in Canada, Australia, and France, that it is a big tech strategy to try and pit publishers against each other. So having a united front is very important. And thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, it was like...
Vivi l'Umbria, con la politica di coesione dell'Unione Europea.